The wetlands along the Choptank River hold their silence the way old ledgers hold their ink, faded, but never entirely gone. In the County Records Office of Talbot County, Maryland, there exists a folder catalogued under a clerical error, filed between an inventory of livestock and a receipt for lumber, that historians did not examine closely until the autumn of 1897. It contains no crime, at least not one the law of its era would have recognized as such. It contains a name written and erased 11 times, a strip of blue cloth stitched in the shape of a crescent moon, and a letter addressed to no one, signed only with the initial E. Taken together, these 3 objects describe a single event that took place on a June morning in 1852 in the yard of a tobacco property overlooking the river, when a man was ordered to whip a woman he did not know was his daughter. Before that morning can be understood, the ordinary years that preceded it must be laid out plainly, because horror in this account does not arrive as a single act. It arrives as a slow accumulation of paperwork, small cruelties, and silences that were never meant to be permanent, until permanence became convenient for everyone except the 2 people at the center of them. Silas Crowe was 46 years old in the summer the whipping occurred, a man enslaved on the Renshaw tobacco property since before anyone still living there could remember him as anything else. He had been given, over the years, a title that carried the appearance of authority without its substance, overseer of field labor, a position the Renshaws found useful because it placed a black man's hand on the whip instead of a white man's, and because it let Colonel Josiah Renshaw tell visiting planters that discipline on his land was administered by one of their own kind, as though that phrase excused anything. Silas had learned, over 2 decades, to perform this role with a peculiar discipline of his own. He never looked at the faces of the people he was ordered to punish. He watched hands, feet, the ground, the motion of the whip itself, anything but eyes. Farmhands who worked beside him for years said he moved through these obligations the way a man walks through a room he has convinced himself is empty. Records from the property, later transcribed into the account book Maria Bell would find 45 years afterward, show that Silas had once had a wife. Her name appears as Esther Bell, a woman held in the main house as a domestic worker, listed in an early ledger as house girl, capable seamstress. Church registers from a small Methodist chapel 2 miles inland record a baptism in the spring of 1830, an infant daughter given the name Clara. No father's name appears beside the entry. This omission was not unusual for the time. Enslaved fathers were routinely left off such records regardless of whether their identity was known to everyone on the property. Oral history collected decades later by Maria Bell from elderly congregants of that same chapel insists that everyone on the Renshaw land knew Silas was Clara's father, and that Esther had asked the minister privately to include his name, a request that was refused. Less than a year after Clara's baptism, 2 events occurred within the same week, and the proximity between them would later strike Maria as too precise to be accidental. Esther Bell was accused of stealing a piece of silver from the main house, an item that never appears in any surviving inventory of Renshaw property before or after the accusation. Within days, she was sold to a plantation broker and transported south, out of Talbot County, beyond any realistic hope of return. In the same week, a notation appears in the parish register stating that the infant Clara had died. No burial record exists, no coroner's note, no grave was ever pointed to by anyone on the property, not then, not later, not when Maria Bell went looking for it in the 1890s and found the church cemetery meticulously kept for white infants and utterly blank where enslaved children's graves should have been. Silas was told his daughter had died of a fever. He was told this by Evelyn Renshaw herself, the colonel's wife, a woman contemporary accounts describe as devout, precise, and unyielding in matters of household order. Silas did not attend a burial because there was none to attend. He carried the news the way men in his position were forced to carry every loss, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, expected to return to the fields the following morning, as though nothing in him had been altered. What Silas did not know, what no one on the property below the level of Evelyn Renshaw and perhaps one or two trusted household servants knew, was that Clara had not died. She had been quietly transferred through an arrangement documented only in a private correspondence found decades later to a neighbouring property 11 miles upriver, owned by a Renshaw cousin. There she was given a different surname, raised as an anonymous enslaved child among many, her true origin erased from any paper that might connect her back to Talbot County. The account book Maria later examined shows a payment recorded simply as settlement family matter, dated the same month as the false death notice, with no further explanation. Why would Evelyn Renshaw go to such lengths over an infant? The answer, as Maria's research would eventually show, had less to do with the child herself and more to do with the disputed inheritance simmering beneath the surface of the Renshaw family for years. Colonel Josiah Renshaw had inherited the property jointly with his elder brother, a man named Thomas Renshaw, who had died under circumstances the family never spoke of publicly. Thomas's will contained a clause, found later in probate records, stipulating that any child of mixed parentage born on the property before a certain date be freed upon reaching adulthood and granted a modest parcel of land, a clause almost certainly inserted out of guilt over a liaison Thomas himself was rumoured to have had. If Clara's parentage and birth date were ever established clearly, she would have had a legal claim, however difficult to enforce for an enslaved person, that could complicate the Renshaw estate for a generation, erasing her existence, or at minimum, scrambling every record that connected her true birth to her true identity, protected not sentiment but property. For 21 years, this arrangement held. Clara grew up on the neighbouring property under the name Clara Higgins, unaware of Esther, unaware of Silas, unaware that the property she had been born on lay only a half-day's walk from where she was raised. She was, by the accounts of those who later remembered her, an unusually literate young woman, having been taught letters informally by an elderly cook who had once served in a household that tolerated such teaching quietly. This literacy would matter enormously later. In 1851, following the death of the Renshaw cousin who owned the neighbouring property, Clara, now recorded again under a slightly altered name, Clara Bell, the surname apparently restored through a clerical accident or a deliberate act no one could later explain, was sold at auction and purchased back by Colonel Josiah Renshaw himself. Whether he recognized her as the child declared dead 2 decades earlier is one of the unresolved questions in Maria's research. The ledger entry recording her purchase lists her simply as field hand, female, approx. 21. No note connects her to the earlier settlement. If Josiah knew, he said nothing. If he did not know, then the coincidence of her return to the very property of her birth becomes one of the account's cruelest ironies, engineered not by fate, but by the ordinary commercial churn of people bought and sold as though they were livestock passed between neighbouring farms. Clara, once back on the Renshaw property, began working in the same fields Silas had overseen for 2 decades. There is no direct testimony describing whether the two ever spoke in the months before her escape, though later testimony gathered by Maria suggests Silas noticed something in her that unsettled him, a manner of carrying herself perhaps, or a stubborn quality in her expression, that he could not name and did not examine because men in his position had learned not to examine such feelings closely. To wonder too much invited a kind of grief that could not be safely carried while still performing the daily labour of survival. It was during this period that Clara began, quietly and at considerable risk, gathering evidence. The full extent of what she understood about the Renshaw estate dispute is not recorded, but fragments survive. A scrap of paper found later, tucked into a shoe recovered from her belongings, listing 3 different names alongside dates, cross-referenced against ages that did not align. Somehow, perhaps through overheard conversations in the main house, perhaps through a sympathetic literate servant, perhaps through her own careful observation of the account book she had occasional access to while performing chores near the study. Clara had begun to suspect that her identity had been deliberately obscured, and that this obscuring was tied to money. In April of 1852, Clara fled. She traveled north along routes later reconstructed by Maria through newspaper advertisements offering rewards for her capture, advertisements that describe her as a mulatto woman, about 22, quick of speech, believed to be carrying forged papers. The phrase, forged papers, is significant because it confirms what family oral history had long claimed. Clara had sewn documents into the hem of her dress, copied pages, perhaps transcribed by hand from the account book itself, intended as proof of the very manipulation that had defined her life without her knowledge. She was captured 3 counties north in a stretch of country near the Delaware line, after a tip from a tavern keeper who recognized the description in a newspaper notice. She was returned to the Renshaw property in early June, and it is here that the documented, undeniable center of this case occurs. Colonel Renshaw, according to the later testimony of a county clerk named Nathaniel Pike, who was present that morning on an unrelated matter of land survey, wanted Clara's punishment to be public. Word had apparently reached him, through channels never fully specified in surviving records, that Clara had attempted to take documents with her, and though the full content of those documents may not have been clear to him, the mere fact of an enslaved woman leaving with paperwork copied from his private ledgers was enough to provoke a fury beyond the usual punishment for escape. He summoned the workers of the property to the yard. He summoned a local minister, not the one who had baptized Clara 2 decades earlier, but a younger man newly arrived in the parish, to lend the proceedings, in the colonel's words as recorded by Pike, the appearance of moral necessity. And he ordered Silas Crowe to administer the punishment. There is no evidence that Colonel Renshaw knew or considered that Silas might be Clara's father. Whether Evelyn Renshaw knew and said nothing is a separate, more troubling question, one Mariah's research suggests the answer to, though the proof remains circumstantial rather than absolute. The letter signed only E, which Mariah's research strongly indicates was written by Esther Bell herself, smuggled north through channels never fully identified, intercepted before it could reach Silas, makes clear that Esther had, 20 years earlier, sewn a strip of blue cloth into her infant daughter's clothing in the shape of a crescent moon, and told Silas that if he ever saw that mark again, he would know their child still lived. The letter, dated some years after Esther's sail south, appears to have been an attempt to finally get word to Silas that Clara had not died, that the story had been false, that their daughter had been placed elsewhere, and that Esther had heard, through channels of her own, rumors of a young woman fitting Clara's description working in the region. That letter never reached Silas. It was intercepted. The evidence strongly suggests by Evelyn Renshaw, who is documented through a separate household inventory, as having kept a strip of blue cloth, kept among private effects for over 20 years, an item with no stated purpose, filed among personal belongings rather than property records, as though it was something to be guarded rather than valued. If Evelyn intercepted Esther's letter and recognized what the blue cloth meant, she made a choice, sustained for 2 decades, to let a man believe his daughter was dead rather than allow a truth to surface that might have unraveled the inheritance arrangement her husband's family depended on. On the morning of the punishment, According to Nathaniel Pike's later deposition, Silas approached Clara to carry out the order and noticed, pinned or sewn near the collar of her dress, a small strip of blue cloth. Pike's account states plainly that Silas stopped and looked at the cloth for longer than was proper, and one of the Renshaw men told him sharply to proceed. D. What passed through Silas in that moment cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Pike's deposition does not claim Silas understood the significance immediately. It claims only that something in his manner changed, that his movements afterward were, in Pike's words, slower and heavier, as though the whip had grown too large for his hand. The punishment was carried out. The record does not dwell on its details, and neither will this account, except to say that it was witnessed by every worker on the property, by the minister brought to sanctify it, and by a father who did not yet know what he had done. What happened afterward is the part of the story most often summarized incorrectly by those who have retold fragments of it since. There was no dramatic recognition in the yard, no cry of a name, no collapse of the whip from Silas's hand in a moment of sudden understanding. According to Pike, Clara was taken afterward to a side room in the overseer's quarters, ostensibly to be confined before being sent to a more distant property as further punishment for her attempted escape. It was there, through a wall too thin to fully contain conversation, that Silas, waiting nearby for reasons Pike's deposition does not clarify, perhaps ordered to guard the room, perhaps drawn there by an instinct he could not have named, overheard an argument between Colonel Renshaw and his wife. In that argument, Evelyn Renshaw, in a moment of anger the colonel later chastised her for, referred to Clara by a name that should have meant nothing to anyone in that house, except for one detail. She called her Esther's girl. Pike's deposition, given many years later to a county clerk documenting old land disputes and never intended as testimony about anything so personal, records only this. Crow did not speak for some time after. He did not ask what was meant by it. He walked away toward the quarters, and I did not see him return that night. There was no reconciliation. There was no confrontation in which father and daughter embraced, no scene of shared grief witnessed by others, no justice delivered by any hand with the authority to deliver it. What there was, instead, was disappearance. The Renshaw property's own labor records show that Silas Crow did not appear for work the following morning, nor any morning after. No pursuit is recorded in surviving newspapers, which is itself unusual, given the value placed on enslaved labor and the typical vigor with which escapes were pursued. Whether this absence of pursuit reflects a deliberate choice by the Renshaws, perhaps out of a desire to avoid further scrutiny of a household already unsettled by the events of that week, or simple administrative failure, is impossible to determine from the surviving record. Clara, meanwhile, was not sent to a distant property as threatened. Instead, within days, she was sold, quickly, quietly, to a broker with connections outside the state. According to a bill of sale later found among Renshaw family papers, dated less than a week after the punishment. The haste of this sale, so soon after a public disciplinary action meant to serve as a deterrent to other would-be runaways, struck Mariah as significant. A public punishment was meant to make an example of the punished. Instead, the punished was removed from view almost immediately afterward, as though someone wanted her gone from the property before further questions could form around her. The documented trail of both figures grows thin after this point. And it is here that Mariah Bell's research, drawing on archives scattered across 3 states, becomes an exercise in reconstruction, from fragments rather than continuous narrative. A list catalogued by a Quaker Aid Society in 1854, documenting black refugees passing through a way station in southern Pennsylvania, includes an entry for a man recorded only as S. Crow, field laborer, approx. late 40s, accompanied by a note from the society's recording clerk stating that the man was unable to speak for some weeks upon arrival, communicating by writing only, and that he carries and will not be parted from a small piece of blue cloth kept always in an inner pocket. And the clerk's note speculates, with evident sympathy but no explanation, that the cloth seems to hold some significance he has not shared. This is the last confirmed documentary trace of Silas Crowe. No death record, no further movement, no reappearance under any name has been located. Whether he settled somewhere under a different identity, whether he died anonymously, whether he eventually learned the fuller truth of what had happened that June morning remains unknown. Clara's trail is somewhat clearer, though no less fragmented. A laundress named Clara Bell appears in Ohio Census and City Directory records beginning in 1858 in the town of Chillicothe, listed as a free woman of color, occupation laundress, no husband recorded. Church membership records from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation in that town list a Clara Bell as a member from 1859 onward, participating for over a decade in the congregation's charitable society, an organization that, notably, assisted formerly enslaved individuals in locating family members separated by sale. A detail Mariah found almost unbearably poignant, given what Clara herself may have been searching for without success. There is no record indicating Clara ever learned that the man who had whipped her in that Maryland yard was her father, nor that she ever learned her mother, Esther, had spent 2 decades trying to send word that her daughter still lived. Clara Bell's death is recorded in a Chillicothe church register in 1879 of causes not specified. At an age listed as about 49, survived, the record notes with unusual specificity for such documents, by no known kin. It is against this backdrop of quiet, undramatic loss that Mariah Bell's discovery in 1897 takes on its full weight. Mariah, a schoolteacher at a community school built in the years following the Civil War on land not far from where the Renshaw property once stood, had been asked by the school's trustees to catalogue old donations and materials stored beneath the floorboards of the building's original schoolroom in preparation for a renovation. She expected ledgers of school supplies, perhaps old primers, perhaps records of enrollment. What she found instead, wrapped in oilcloth and pushed far back beneath a loose board, was a small wooden box containing the account book, the letter signed E, in the strip of blue cloth. Mariah's background made her uniquely suited to recognize the significance of what she had found. She had grown up hearing fragments of local oral history from elderly congregants at the same church where Clara had once been baptized. Stories about a woman who had vanished and a man who had never spoken again after a terrible morning in a tobacco yard. She had assumed, as most who heard such stories assumed, that these were the kind of half-remembered legends every rural community accumulates, impossible to verify, likely exaggerated. The account book changed that assumption entirely. She spent the better part of 2 years working alongside the school's evening hours, cross-referencing the account book's altered entries against surviving probate records, church registers, newspaper archives in Baltimore and Wilmington, and correspondence held by a historical society in Talbot County that had, by pure administrative accident, retained a portion of the old Renshaw family papers after the estate was finally dissolved and sold off in pieces during the 1860s. It was through this correspondence that she found Nathaniel Pike's deposition, filed among unrelated land survey disputes, apparently included only because Pike had mentioned the events of that June morning as an aside while testifying about property boundaries. A stray remembrance that nearly went unrecorded and that survived only because a clerk, decades earlier, had transcribed testimony too thoroughly rather than too little. What Mariah ultimately assembled was not a story with the satisfaction of resolution. It was a story about the mechanics of erasure, about how a family protected its wealth and reputation, not through any single dramatic act of violence, but through decades of small, careful administrative choices: a false death notice, a transferred child, an intercepted letter, a hastily arranged sale, a name scratched out and rewritten in a ledger 3 separate times. The horror of the case, as Mariah wrote in the notes she eventually compiled for the school's archive, was not contained in the punishment itself, terrible as it was, but in the patience of it. The years of quiet paperwork that made it possible for a father to raise a whip against his own daughter without either of them knowing, and for everyone responsible for that ignorance to go on living comfortably beside it. Dame Mariah never found evidence that Silas and Clara ever learned the truth, nor that they ever crossed paths again after that June morning. She considered, in her private notes, the possibility that Silas's disappearance into Pennsylvania and eventual unrecorded fate meant he carried the truth, once he learned it from the argument overheard through the thin wall. For the remainder of whatever life he had, alone, unable to act on it, unable even to fully process it, given the speed with which Clara was sold away. She considered, too, that Clara may have lived out her decades in Ohio, never suspecting that the man who had struck her in that yard was searching, blindly and without success, for a daughter he believed had died in infancy. The letter from Esther, the one that never reached Silas, closes with a line Mariah transcribed carefully into her own notes. Underlining it twice, "I ask only that he know her before others decide who she was." Esther herself does not appear again in any record after her sail south in 1831. Whether she lived to hear any rumor of what had become of the daughter she tried, across 2 decades and however many miles, to send word of, is unknown. The account book, the letter, and the strip of blue cloth were eventually donated, along with Mariah's compiled research, to a regional historical society where they remain catalogued not under the Renshaw family name, but under a small separate designation Mariah insisted upon before her own death in 1912. Bell and Crow, family record restored. The Renshaw property itself no longer stands. The main house burned in an accidental fire in 1881. And the surrounding land was subdivided and sold off in small parcels over the following decades, its tobacco fields eventually given over to other crops, its old yard, the specific stretch of ground where a public punishment was once staged before witnesses and a minister brought to sanctify it, absorbed indistinguishably into what is now an ordinary field bordering a county road. Nothing marks it. No plaque, no memorial, nothing to suggest to anyone driving past that a father once raised his hand against his daughter there, both of them unknowing, while the people responsible for that ignorance stood by, satisfied with the order they had preserved. Mariah's notes end with an observation she chose not to soften for the record. She wrote that the true crime committed against Silas Crow and Clara Bell was not contained in a single morning, nor in a single whip, nor even in the sale that followed. It was contained in every quiet correction made to a ledger, every silence maintained by people who understood exactly what they were protecting and chose, again and again, over 20 years, to protect it. The horror of the Renshaw property, she concluded, was never in what happened in its yard. It was in the meticulous, unremarkable paperwork that made such a thing possible, and in how easily that paperwork survived, folded and forgotten beneath a schoolhouse floor for 45 years, waiting only for someone patient enough and perhaps angry enough to read it all the way through.